So very welcome to this morning's seminar with Anandi Hattiangadi. And Anandi is, as you know, professor of philosophy at Stockholm University and also a member of the Professura Scientia program. She started her studies in philosophy at York University in Ontario, and some of you may know that is also, but this is by sheer coincidence, the place where the Journal of Philosophy of Social Science is being published. And then Anandi carried on at University of Toronto, and then subsequently doing in philosophy, and then subsequently being at the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at Cambridge, where she did her Ph.D. and then was also a fellow of Trinity College afterwards. But for many years, Anandi was at the University of Oxford teaching philosophy, but also both at the university and in St. Hilda's College. And then we were fortunate enough that she came to Sweden, and I think the Department of Philosophy of Stockholm has been very successful, both in general terms and in terms of recruiting wonderful young faculty and also using the Professura Scientia program in a very wise way. So for us, it's a great delight that Anandi is in this program. I have listened to her many times, but normally she has been speaking about questions of epistemology or ontology, even metaphysics, to some extent metaethics, but of course touching upon questions of philosophy of science, because that is always there. But I've never heard her address this theme of relativism in the STS before, and that's a very interesting and provocative theme. I will not speak at length about what we have been doing, but this is a long-standing interest of this Collegium, and if you would glance through the 500 names of former fellows, you will find that there are, well, a rather substantial share of people working in this field have been fellows of this Collegium, or we also have had many editorial meetings of the International Yearbook and the Sociology of the Sciences. Sociology in this sense, in this context, comprise also embracing philosophy and history of science. So if I were to mention some people who I don't think are outright relativists, but not so far from that position, I mean, the person who started the whole journal, the Journal of Social Epistemology, Steve Fuller, was a fellow here, and a number of the members of his editorial board, including the now long retired professor of history of science at Harvard, Everett Mendelsohn, also a former fellow here, are people we have close contacts with. Well, Stephen Turner is another one. There are several Stephen Turners, but the philosopher in Florida. And many historians of science, including Hans-Jürgen Reinberger last year, but Peter Weingart has been here repeatedly. We have worked a lot. Randall Collins, if you think of him as a philosopher, at least an historian of philosophy, wrote his magnum opus on the history of philosophy to some extent with us. And we have had a large number of other people. Helga Novotny has spoken also actually at Professura meetings about some of the issues I think you will come upon, and so has Sheila Jasanoff. Well, I will not say anything more, but we all greatly look forward to listening to you, Anandi. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here again this term. This is my fourth term at Scas, and it's always a wonderful opportunity to really focus on research and get to know the wonderful people who are here. So the talk that I'm going to give today takes me back to my grad school days. This is something that I haven't worked on directly since then, but nevertheless touches upon issues and ideas that I've been working on in slightly different contexts all along. Okay, so researchers in science and technology studies, or STS, have recently been ruminating about whether the current age of so-called post-truth politics raises a challenge for the discipline. There was a special issue of the journal SSS, Social Studies of Science, devoted to this question, and there have been multiple blog posts. In fact, just yesterday there was a kind of related symposium at LSE on post-truth and postmodernism. This is related because postmodernism is thought of as a form of relativism. Okay, so what's post-truth? Well, this is a term that was voted the term of the year in 2016 It's an adjective that's defined by the Oxford dictionaries as, quote, relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. The term is thought to aptly characterize some distinctive features of our current social and political predicament, which involve the following. There's an open disregard for truth and evidence exhibited by some of the highest-ranking politicians, an overtly hostile approach towards experts, coupled with debunking of scientific evidence when it supports inconvenient truths, and a media and cultural environment in which there's this idea of journalistic balance, the idea that there are always two sides to every issue, even when one side is demonstrably false or misguided. Of course, I don't want to say that all of this is completely new. If anything is old news, it's that politicians lie. Nevertheless, one might think that Donald Trump has undoubtedly taken it up a notch. Indeed, according to the distinguished emeritus professor from Princeton, Harry Frankfurt, Trump does not merely lie, technically speaking, he bullshits. This is actually a technical term that Frankfurt defines as follows. He says, unlike the liar, who says what he knows to be false, or at least believes to be false, the bullshitter is not constrained by any consideration of what may or may not be true. In making his assertion, he is indifferent to whether what he says is true or false. His goal is not to report facts, it's rather to shape the beliefs and attitudes of his listeners in a certain way. So Trump was bullshitting, for instance, when he said, quote, we have lousy healthcare where it's going up 35, 45, 55%, when in fact premiums had only increased by 5.8% a year since Obama had taken office. But the point is, Trump was not concerned about informing his audience of the truth or even making them believe some specific lie, right? Which was it supposed to be, 35, 45, or 55%? Rather, his aim was just to get them to feel, to emote, and agree that healthcare was lousy, right? And this total disregard for truth and evidence is exacerbated by some of Trump's advocates, like Kellyanne Conway, who have defended his bullshitting by appeal to the notion of alternative facts, or by reporting that, I think this is Nellie Scott Hughes. I got that wrong. There are no such things, unfortunately, as facts anymore. The hostility towards experts and the debunking of science is also not peculiar to 2016, right? No more than the mendacity of politicians. So politically motivated inference in the public reporting of scientific findings about climate science, for example, about climate change, can be traced back at least to the administration of George Bush. And the debunking of science by vested commercial interests, such as the tobacco lobby, famously goes back even further. Yet the climate change debate is a good example of a case where things seem to have come to a head. Despite the fact that 97% of the scientific articles published to date support the belief in anthropogenic climate change, Trump notoriously claimed that climate change is a hoax put forward by the Chinese. Of course, he was bullshitting, but nevertheless, the debunking of climate science by conservative politicians and the fossil fuel industry has been remarkably effective in shaping public opinion. So according to a 2016 report of the Pew Research Center, public opinion in the US about climate science has become polarized along the left-right axis. So the things to note here is that the question, the Earth is warming mostly due to human activity. You see conservative Republicans only 15%, moderate and liberal Republicans only 34%. The Democrats are concentrated on the higher end of the agreement with this proposition spectrum, and it's really only 40% of US adults who agree with this statement. Okay. In addition to this sort of polarization of public opinion on matters empirical, there's been an increase in the prevalence of the view that even such straightforwardly empirical questions as whether human activity is a major contributing factor in climate change are to be decided by some kind of openly partisan debate, rather than by the use of rigorous scientific methods. So, for example, the EPA administrator, Scott Pruitt, recommended a televised red team, blue team exercise on climate change in which the red team, composed of conservative climate change deniers, would thrash it out with the blue team, composed of liberal-leaning climate scientists and environmental activists. Similarly, I don't know if any of you followed this, but James Bennett, the opinion page editor of the New York Times, hired Bret Stephens, who is a self-styled climate agnostic, to be one of the columnists in those pages. In defense of this appointment, in reaction to a kind of public outcry about it, Bennett doesn't say anything about truth or evidence. He says that what he claims to be doing is promoting the free exchange of ideas, right? Regardless of whether they are or are not true. So this kind of red team, blue team, even-handed approach to empirical questions is just an example of the kind of even-handed epistemology that seems to be prevalent in daily life. So what does all this have to do with STS? So although there is some debate about whether our post-truth predicament poses a challenge to STS at all, most people agree that if it poses a challenge, the challenge must have something to do with relativism. Though there are subtle differences between different schools in STS, many schools have been profoundly influenced by the view that scientific knowledge is in some sense relative to a social or cultural practice, either because truth is practice relative, or because epistemic and rational norms are practice relative, or because scientific facts are in some sense socially constructed. For instance, I don't know where their name has gone. That's Barry Barnes and David Bloor. They famously put forward what's called the Symmetry Principle, according to which, which recommended that sociologists of science, quote, investigate the contingent determinants of belief and reasoning without regard to whether the beliefs are true or the inference is rational. The result of applying this principle led to the conclusion that, quote, there is no sense attached to the idea that some standards or beliefs and reasoning are rational as distinct from merely locally accepted as such. There are no context-free or supercultural norms of rationality. So in addition, classic texts in STS have sought to show that what's called closure on any scientific question must always be brought about by some kind of social negotiation. That was Harry Collins. That scientific belief, whether true or false, rational or irrational, is always influenced by social factors. That was Barnes and Bloor. Or that norms of rationality are not external, but emerge from practices, or that scientific facts are in some sense socially constructed. And I've given you Bruno Latour as the proponent of that claim. This relativism seems to resonate with the even-handed epistemology of post-truth politics, right? It resonates with the idea that empirical matters are to be settled by some kind of political negotiation. So all this really shows is that STS has acquired some unattractive bedfellows, but post-truth seems to raise a far deeper challenge than this. And I think that the people who really put their finger on what the challenge is are Naomi Oreskes and Eric Baker. They say that the particular form of relativism within science studies permits, quote, did I put the quote? No, I didn't. Permits, quote, neither criticism of scientific claims with any real teeth, nor the possibility of collective action built on public knowledge. The problem, they claim, is that, quote, if normative judgments external to a social practice are illegitimate, analysts are barred from making any arguments for or against particular views or practices, end quote. So once again, like the mendacity of politicians, the objection that they raise here is not entirely new. It's the familiar Quietism, so-called Quietism objection to relativism. If I may put it this way, it's that if the relativist accepts that all truths are relative to a social practice, It would be incoherent to then go on to insist that it's just plain true that, say, greenhouse gases cause global warming, or that Trump's claim that climate change is a hoax is just plain false. If the relativist accepts that all epistemic norms are relative to a practice, it would be incoherent for them to then go on to claim that some other epistemic practice in which she doesn't participate, such as the practice of conspiracy theorists, is epistemically defective. And if all facts are socially constructed, it seems that climate change deniers can, just like the climate scientists, construct the facts that fit with their social interests. Though the quietism objection may not be new, it does seem to be raised by post-truth politics with a new urgency. However, old objections often come with old responses. So there are a number of standard responses that have been made in the past on behalf of relativists to this kind of challenge. So for instance, the relativist might concede that having accepted relativism, she can't then go on to claim that it's just plain true in some absolute non-relativized sense that greenhouse gases cause global warming, but she can coherently say that this is true in some relative sense. Okay, so my aim in this paper is going to be to investigate this quietism objection to relativism to see whether the challenge ultimately sticks. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the sort of motivations that led to the kind of relativism that's influential in STS in the first place. And where I'm going back to is Wittgenstein's rule-following considerations, which I think form the theoretical underpinning of a very influential picture within STS. Though not all forms of relativism in STS can be traced back to Wittgensteinian ideas, I do think that the picture that the Wittgensteinians wind up with has a lot of affinity with other schools within STS. Okay. So, Wittgensteinian relativism. Imagine that you're asked to add two numbers that you have never added before. For simplicity, we can assume that you have never added numbers greater than 57, say. And you are now asked to add 57 and 68. After a moment's thought, perhaps you give the answer 125. But now a skeptic comes along and challenges your answer. The challenge concerns not the mathematical fact that 57 plus 68 is 125, but the semantic fact, the fact about what you mean, right? The fact concerning what you mean by the word plus. What the skeptic is questioning is whether you really mean addition by plus. True, she says, if you mean addition by plus, then 125 is the correct answer, but perhaps what you mean by plus is quaddition, where x plus y equals x plus y if x and y are less than or equal to 57, and x plus 5 equals 5 otherwise. The skeptic asks, what makes it the case that you mean addition rather than quaddition by plus? She asks for the facts in virtue of which you mean one thing rather than another. And she argues that there are no such facts. The argument is complex, and I'm only going to cover it very briefly. But first of all, you might start by noting that your past behavior is compatible with both continuations, both the addition function and the quaddition function. Since we assume to begin with that you hadn't ever previously added any numbers greater than 57, your past behavior is compatible with your meaning either addition or quaddition by plus. But now suppose that you answer the skeptic by saying, look, when I learned to add, I gave myself instructions on how to work out the answer. I told myself this: if I'm asked to add numbers m and n, I will first count out m marbles, and then I will count out n marbles, then I'll put the marbles together, and I'll count the resulting heap. And when I perform this procedure, I find that 57 plus 68 is 125. But the skeptic has an immediate reply to this move. She says, sure, if when you gave yourself instructions in the past you meant count by the word count, but suppose what you really meant was quount, where to quount a heap of marbles is to count them until you get to the 57th marble, after which you should just keep saying 5. The problem is that if you appeal to some past intention, right, an intention to carry out a certain procedure, in explanation of the fact that you mean addition by plus, you appeal to something that is itself a representation, that itself has a certain kind of meaning, and the skeptic can always ask you what your understanding of that representation consists in. If you keep appealing to more and more representations, say, instructions for how to count, this initiates a kind of infinite regress. The skeptic then argues that, in contrast, if you do not appeal to anything representational, you seem to be entirely unable to answer the skeptic's question. Suppose, for instance, that you argue that you now mean addition by plus in virtue of the fact that you are disposed, and have been disposed all along, to give the answer 125. More generally, you might say, what it is to mean addition by plus is to be disposed to give the sum of any two numbers when asked. The skeptic argues, however, that the dispositional theory only tells us what you will or would do. The fact that you mean addition by plus, in contrast, entails that 125 is the correct answer, not just the answer that you would or will make. For instance, if you might be disposed to make mistakes, right? It doesn't go without saying that whatever you would do is correct. For example, you might be disposed not to carry a digit in certain circumstances, and then you'll get a different answer than the one that accords with the addition function. So even if you are disposed to say that 57 plus 68 is 125, the skeptic can always argue that you are making a mistake. Really, because you mean quaddition by plus, the answer you should give is 5. Okay, so I'm just going to leave it there. I'm not going to go through all the ins and outs of these arguments, but basically the structure of the view, the structure of the argumentation is either you appeal to a representation, in which case you initiate an infinite regress, or you don't, in which case you just have no satisfactory answer to the skeptic. Wittgenstein sums up the sort of gist of this argument when he says this in the Philosophical Investigations. This was our paradox. No course of action could be determined by a rule because every course of action can be made out to accord with the rule. The answer was, if everything can be made out to accord with the rule, then it can also be made out to conflict with it. And so there would be neither accord nor conflict here. Okay. So what's going on in this passage is really Wittgenstein rejecting a very plausible, very common sense view that was prevalent in philosophy and continues to be, or a kind of picture of meaning, representation, and rationality. So it'll help to get a sense of what relativism is to see what Wittgensteinian relativism amounts to if we see what the target of the rule-following considerations really is. Okay, so the first part of the target is what I'm calling realism. This is realism about truth and meaning in particular. So one target of the rule-following considerations is this kind of broadly realist picture. There are many different ways of spelling out the details. So I'm just going to use the term representation as a term that covers expressions and sentences in a language, as well as their mental analogs, some kind of concepts or thoughts that one might have. So according to a broadly realist picture, there's a fact of the matter, what some representations mean, and whether they are true. Maybe there are some representations that have no meaning, But those that have a meaning are such that there's a fact of the matter what they mean. And maybe there are some representations that are just not truth evaluable. You can set those aside. But those that are, there are some that are, and there's a fact of the matter whether they are true or false. And the second part of the realist's picture is that the meaning and truth of at least some representations consists in some kind of relation to reality. Right? There's a real relation between words and the world. So, for example, consider the sentence, Socrates is wise. According to realists, the name Socrates denotes the man Socrates, and the predicate is wise denotes the set of all wise things, so that the sentence, Socrates is wise, is true if and only if the man denoted by the name Socrates is in the set denoted by the predicate, is wise. These are all thought of as real relations that hold between an expression or a thought and the world. Okay, the second part of the target is rationalism. According to the rationalist, there are universal and objective normative truths about belief and reasoning. These are sometimes called norms of rationality. They may include logical principles, such as that you ought not to have contradictory beliefs, or if you believe that P, and if you believe that P implies Q, then you ought to believe Q. This is modus ponens. We're going to come back to this in a moment. They also include epistemological principles, such as the general principle that you ought to proportion your belief to the evidence. So Wittgenstein's rule-following considerations are designed to call into question the objectivity of all of these rules, the rules of rationality as well as the rules of meaning. Okay, so the rule-following considerations, so far I've only really talked about the meaning-determining rules. But there's a similar kind of argument that is brought against rationalism. Again, the considerations object to dispositionalism, though on a slightly different score. So the objection to a dispositionalist view of rationality, or the rules of rationality, is that there's a difference between acting in accordance with a rule and being guided by a rule. So an automaton can act in accordance with a rule, but meaning something seems to have some kind of internal component that involves guidance by a rule. So an automaton, we might think, could act in accordance with the rule and still not understand the meaning of a word. But Wittgenstein argues that any attempt to give an account of guidance by a rule seems to lead, once again, to an infinite regress. This doesn't come from Wittgenstein, but there's a rather nice example of an infinite regress of the kind that Wittgenstein has in mind, that's discussed by Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland, in a short note entitled What the Tortoise Said to Achilles. So Carroll imagines that the tortoise and Achilles have just had a race, and Achilles has beaten the tortoise. And very pleased with himself, he sits down on the tortoise's back, and the tortoise starts to argue with him in the hope of showing him that there is something that he is committed to, which involves an infinite regress. And the thing that he's committed to is this argument from Euclid, which goes as follows. A, things that are equal to the same are equal to each other. That's the first premise. B, the two sides of this triangle are things that are equal to the same. And the conclusion, Z, the two sides of this triangle are equal to each other. So what the tortoise says to Achilles is, okay, you accept this argument. It, as it happens, is an example of modus ponens. You accept this argument, but the tortoise, playing devil's advocate, claims not to accept it. In particular, the tortoise rejects the move from A and B, the premises, to the conclusion. He says, look, let's just say I'm the kind of person who accepts A and B, but doesn't accept Z. Why? Because he doesn't accept this intermediate premise. This is what he calls the hypothetical. He's calling it C. If A and B are true, then Z must be true. Okay, so the tortoise claims not to accept this, and because he doesn't accept this, he won't accept the inference from A and B to Z. Now Achilles says to the tortoise, well, then you just do me a favor and accept C. And the tortoise says, okay, I'll do you that favor. I'll accept C. What happened? Okay. Sorry, my slides have not worked properly. So just focus on C for the moment. If A and B are true, Z must be true. The tortoise accepts that, but then goes on to say that nevertheless, she doesn't accept the inference to Z because he rejects D. All along, the tortoise keeps telling Achilles to write each of these things that he accepts down in his notebook. Right? And at this point, when we get to D, Achilles starts to become frustrated. He says to the tortoise, if you do not accept D, then logic would take you by the throat. Here we are. If you do not accept D, then logic would take you by the throat and force you to do it. Achilles triumphantly replied, logic would tell you you can't help yourself. Now that you've accepted A, B, and C and D, you must accept Z. You have no choice, you see. And the tortoise replies, whatever logic is good enough to tell me is worth writing down. So please enter it into your book. We'll call it E. If A and B and C and D are true, Z must be true. Until I've granted that, I needn't grant Z. So it's quite a necessary step, you see. I see, said Achilles, and there was a touch of sadness in his tone. Okay, so what exactly is at issue in this regress? There are often two ways to read it. The most common way is to read it as an epistemological regress, about the epistemological justification of deduction. On the epistemological reading, the regress worry is really that Achilles doesn't know that Z follows from A and B. But Wittgenstein's regress is, I think, a little bit different. It's a metaphysical regress about what constitutes the normativity or the normative authority of this rule. The worry is there's nothing in the regress to give normative authority to the rule, to show that the tortoise must accept Z. The tortoise must accept Z is not grounded in anything that gives it normative authority. Because each thing you put is another thing for which its normative authority is in question. Okay. So now we can look at the relativist picture, what the relativist picture itself looks like. The Wittgensteinian relativist recommends giving up the realist and rationalist picture altogether. She claims that there are no semantic relations of reference or truth that hold between representations and reality. So the idea is not that all of the dispositions of everyone in a community taken together determine or constitute the fact that we mean addition by plus on a realist reading of what that would be. The thought is not that there's a rule that we're following in any given case that gets determined and then gets applied. Rather, according to the Wittgensteinian picture, both the rule and its correctness conditions, its correct applications, are emergent in practice. So you can think of an analogy with a kind of casual game that we play. We take a ball, we kick it around. This is one of Wittgenstein's examples. We take a ball and we kick it around, and we kind of make the rules up as we go along. We're not specifically playing football, but we're just sort of making it up as we go along. And this is the sort of analogy to the picture that the Wittgensteinian relativist has about language, about meaning, and rationality. On this view, in our language game, the very significance of our expressions and concepts, the very correctness conditions, the application conditions of our rules are constituted in an ongoing way by social negotiation. So one way to get at the difference is to consider a kind of potted history of the classification of cetaceans, right? The whales and the dolphins. Though differences between cetaceans and fish, other types of fish, had been noted for centuries, it really wasn't until the publication of the 10th edition of Systema Naturae by the Uppsala hero Linnaeus that cetaceans ceased to be classified as fish and came to be classified as mammals, as they are still classified today. Okay, according to a realist take on what happened, there was a change in the concept of, say, fish. Prior to the late 1750s, the concept that people had of fish included whales and dolphins, and post-late 1750s, or maybe once consensus was reached around that issue or something like that, at that point, the concept had a different extension. Okay, but according to the Wittgensteinian relativist, this is not the correct way of viewing this transition in thought. Because that would be to commit to the idea that concepts have extensions, that they stand in these real relations to sets or objects, and that's to be rejected. Rather, what the Wittgensteinian relativist might say is that the significance of the concept fish, or the term fish, changed during this period, just not in this way. So rather, the thought is it was acceptable or legitimate for someone to say dolphins are fish prior to the late 1750s, and unacceptable or illegitimate for them to say it after, but this has nothing to do with this kind of relation between the terms and the world. On the Wittgensteinian relativist view, once there's agreement or consensus around a certain issue, it becomes legitimate to make truth claims on that issue. Since the claims around which consensus forms change from one historical context to the next, right? And we don't want to say that the same sentence or the same thought is both true and not true. They claim truth must be relativized to social or historical contexts, to language games, or, to use Wittgenstein's term, forms of life. So I give you a quote by my former supervisor in HPS Cambridge, Martin Cush. He says, his view, which he called, this is Wittgensteinian relativism, meaning finitism is part of it. Meaning finitism holds that a plausible answer to this question, the question of the correctness or incorrectness of an application of a rule, must invoke the consensus of a community of language users. What makes an application of a word correct rather than incorrect is that one's interlocutors let one get away with, or perhaps even praise, the way in which one has judged the similarity between a shared exemplar and a newly encountered entity. Only others' agreement can constitute correctness. So this kind of view, according to Wittgensteinian relativism, applies equally to rules of rationality. The idea is that there are no universal and objective norms governing good reasoning. That was part of the bad old realist picture that we want to get rid of. The idea is that rules of rationality are emergent, not given in advance or operating from the outside. The rules themselves and their conditions for their correct application are simultaneously negotiated as we go along, and they are constituted from one moment to the next. So they claim that all of these normative assessments of correctness and incorrectness only make sense relative to the practice from which they emerged. Okay, I had said that there were other kinds of relativism or other schools within STS that don't have a Wittgensteinian background, and yet I think that there are certain affinities between this kind of picture and many other schools within STS. So, for example, the ethnomethodologist tradition within STS also claims that rationality and other kinds of classification systems or concepts, meanings, are emergent in practices. So this is a kind of common theme that appears in the ethnomethodological tradition as well as in this one. And also the sort of Latourian social constructivist or actor network theory approach, which has its roots in semiotics, not in Wittgenstein, is similarly, in many ways, is similarly committed to the idea that scientific facts, scientific knowledge, is constructed in this kind of ongoing way through social negotiation, that there's nothing that sort of the concept or meaning or some rule that exists in advance and is then applied, but rather that both things are constantly created or constituted as we go along. Okay, so now that we have a good view of the Wittgensteinian relativist picture, we can think about the Quietism challenge. Okay, so to properly state this challenge, I think it's best to begin by distinguishing between the notion of an object language in contrast with the meta-theory. So Wittgensteinian relativism is a meta-theory. It's a theory of the truth, about the nature of the truth or falsity of certain types of thought and talk, the rationality or irrationality of belief, what that consists in, how it's constituted. The object language, in contrast, is the thought and talk that is the target of the meta-theory. Okay, so this distinction becomes a lot clearer in cases where relativism is advanced about a particular domain. So, for example, some analytic philosophers have advanced a relativist theory of truth specifically with regard to statements of personal taste, like spinach is delicious, right? According to this view, it's only statements of that kind that deserve a relativist treatment. So in this case, it's easier to see the distinction between the object language and the meta-language or the meta-theory, because in this case, the object language constitutes thought and talk about personal taste, while the meta-theory is a relativist kind of theory about that domain, that kind of thought and talk. The distinction becomes a little bit complicated when we think about Wittgensteinian relativism, because the relativist thesis that the Wittgensteinian puts forward is a form of global relativism. It applies to all thought and talk, right? And which means that the relativist's own discourse, the relativist's own meta-theory, is also part of the object language. But this kind of self-reference is not in itself a problem and shouldn't let us, and doesn't complicate the distinction between the meta-theory and the object language to the point where we can't use it anymore. Rather, we just need to be able to see this as, say, two different roles that certain kinds of statements can make, can play, rather. Okay, so with this in place, I think we can state the Quietism challenge in a nutshell as follows. The Quietism challenge is that there is some kind of incoherence between the relativist meta-theory and some aspects of the object language. Okay, so to fix ideas, it's going to help to have a particular set of object language statements and judgments in mind. And I'm going to take the debate about climate change as my example. I'm also going to assume, for the sake of argument, that the kind of relativist we are dealing with here is someone who is actively, as an agent, engaged in this debate, or is at least well informed about the scientific literature, the scientific evidence, and who believes in anthropogenic climate change on the basis of that evidence. We can even imagine that these beliefs guide her behavior. She prefers to cycle or take public transport rather than driving. She votes for the Green Party, and so forth. So she cares about this issue. Okay, so one way for there to be an incoherence between the meta-theory and the object language is if the two, or some statements in the two domains, are incompatible with one another. For instance, it might be argued that the claim that all truth is relative is incompatible with the claim that it's just plain true that greenhouse gas emissions contribute significantly to climate change. Right? This just plain true thing doesn't seem to be coherently talked about once you're a relativist. And this challenge does seem to be compelling on the face of it. You can't say that all truth is relative and then go on to say that something is just plain true. But the relativist has, as I mentioned previously, a pretty easy response to this challenge. She can concede that she can't say that anything is just plain true in the realist sense of truth, but she can say that it's true in some relativist sense, that, say, greenhouse gas emissions contribute significantly to climate change. And all she really needs is this weaker notion of relativist truth in order to engage effectively in the debate about climate change. Now, this is a kind of standard answer on behalf of the relativist, but I think it's really problematic in the context of Wittgensteinian relativism of the kind that I have just sketched. The problem is that the Wittgensteinian relativist takes the view that the truth itself is a product of ongoing social negotiation. So once we have consensus on a question, the consensus legitimates our talk of truth or falsity, right? Then it becomes okay to say that something is true or false. But what about when there is no consensus? Arguably, that's the situation in which we find ourselves with regard to the climate change debate. Even if it's true that 97% of climate scientists believe in anthropogenic climate change, there's still a very well-funded, highly influential, and vociferous minority of climate change deniers who reject this belief. Moreover, if we look at the population, for example, of the United States, opinion is pretty evenly divided. I think it was 48% on that chart that we saw previously. Opinion is pretty evenly divided over this question. Given the Wittgensteinian relativist account of the conditions under which it is legitimate to say that something is true, it seems it's illegitimate to say that greenhouse gas emissions make a significant contribution to climate change. Okay, similarly, I think there is a prima facie incoherence between the Wittgensteinian relativist's meta-theory and the object language claims that she's likely to wish to make about the evidence that supports her belief in anthropogenic climate change. Once again, there seems to be an obvious incompatibility between the claim that rationality is all relative to epistemic practices and the claim that some beliefs are just plain rational or just plain irrational. And once again, this formulation of quietism is pretty plausible, but it also has a very obvious response. Right? The relativist is likely to claim that she only needs to be able to critique the irrationality of beliefs of her opponents in some weaker relativized sense. So, for example, in the climate change debate, the relativist might argue that though there may be disagreements between climate change believers and climate change deniers, we are all nevertheless part of the same epistemic practice, the same form of life, right? Both sides have experts who are trained as scientists, and so both sides share a core acceptance of scientific methods of experimentation, observation, specific paradigms on modeling and the analysis of data. The relativist who believes in anthropogenic climate change can simply appeal to these shared standards to make her critical case. She can show by appeal to these shared standards, as has in fact been done, that the 3% of articles on climate science that go against the grain of the mainstream are flawed in their argumentation their assumptions, their models, their data analyses, and so forth. However, again, I think this sort of response is just not clearly available to the Wittgensteinian relativist. Recall that according to the Wittgensteinian relativist, there is no fact of the matter which of several rules we follow. Which rules we follow and what counts as a correct application of them are both simultaneously constituted as we go along, as a result of this ongoing process of negotiation. This means that there's just no antecedent fact of the matter, whether or not the climate change deniers' arguments, assumptions, models, or analyses are flawed according to the standards that we both accept. Both the question whether they are flawed and which standards we accept are right now open for social negotiation. If there were a consensus on both the standards and their application, it would be legitimate against the background of that consensus to claim that one set of beliefs is flawed or irrational. But in the absence of that consensus, Wittgensteinian relativism entails that it's either indeterminate or uncertain whether that work is really flawed. Since it is as yet indeterminate or uncertain which rules we are following, which standards we accept. A similar difficulty arises for the Wittgensteinian relativist who wishes to mount an internal critique of the climate change denier's case. An internal critique is one that appeals only to the standards that are internal to the practice being critiqued. So, for example, the relativist might argue that she can simply appeal to the climate change denier's own standards and demonstrate that the denier's beliefs and evidence are at odds with his fundamental epistemic principles, or even that his claims are internally inconsistent. For example, many climate change deniers argue that belief in anthropogenic climate change is unjustified because it's based on models into which many uncertain assumptions must be fed. Right? So they say that we should suspend judgment. We should not wholeheartedly go in for this belief because it's too uncertain given the uncertainties in the modeling. But at the same time, they claim that we are justified in believing economists' projections about the cost of implementing a carbon tax, though economists' models rely on no fewer and no less certain assumptions. Right? So you might say there's an inconsistency here in their epistemological attitude towards modeling. So, though this is an obvious kind of internal criticism one might make of the climate change denier's set of beliefs, it's really not available to the Wittgensteinian relativist. Once again, recall that Wittgenstein says that any course of action can be made out to accord with the rule. And if this holds in general, then it holds of the climate change denier's epistemic commitments, or the rules or the standards that the climate change deniers themselves follow. So if the climate change deniers do deem the belief on the basis of current economic models to be legitimate, and do in fact deem the belief based on the basis of current climate models to be illegitimate, then that's just how it is by the results of the standards that they follow, that are internal to their practice. These normative judgments and the standards themselves are emergent simultaneously. Right? There's no gap between the standards and the practice. They all get constituted en masse. Okay, so now the relativist might retrench and say not that she criticizes the climate change deniers on the basis of shared standards and not on the basis of internal standards either, but on the basis of her own standards, the standards that the relativist herself accepts and that she shares with the smaller subgroup of the overall population of climate change scientists, environmentalists, and the general public who agree with her. Relative to this sub-community, there is consensus around the standards, and there is consensus around their correct application. Relative to this sub-community, to our standards, the research of climate change deniers is determinately flawed, right? So the thought is that if deniers and believers participate in different language games, nevertheless, the participants of one language game can critique the participants the views of the participants of the other on the basis of their own standards. But yet again, I don't think that this kind of response is available to the Wittgensteinian relativist. And the reason is now that she claims that normative notions concerning correctness or incorrectness, rationality or irrationality, only make any sense, right? They only have a significance or meaning within a language game, right? The idea is that there's no gap between a rule and its correct application, since both emerge simultaneously. And the Wittgensteinian relativist claims that it's only in such contexts of broad agreement that the normative questions of correctness and incorrectness can have any significance. So when the environmentalist critiques the research published by climate change deniers, her critiques emerge from her practice and are appropriately related to the judgments that are made by herself and her peers. If the deniers participate in a different language game, then there's a kind of category mistake inherent in critique across the aisle. Right? An example of a category mistake is something like thinking that the color red is large. Right? It's the idea that these two concepts just don't really fit together. Largeness is not something that the color red can be. And similarly, because the climate change believers, standards, meanings, judgments all hang together in a certain way and don't hang together with those of the climate change denier, there can be no critique. Critique across these two language games is a bit like a category mistake. Okay, so finally I want to turn to a response, a kind of overall response to the quietism worry that I frequently come across that really invokes the difference between the meta theory and the object language and the idea that these constitute themselves two different frames of reference. Sometimes sociologists put these two frames of reference in terms of the context or the frame of reference of the theorist versus the frame of reference of the actor. So the relativist now claims that she accepts Wittgensteinian relativism as a theorist, but that acceptance is fully compatible with carrying on as she normally would as an actor. And the reason, so on the face of it, this might look like a non-starter, right? Because as we've just seen, the claim that consensus that P, some proposition P, grounds the legitimacy of the claim that P is true is straightforwardly incompatible with claiming that P is true in some context when you know that there's no consensus whether P. However, there is a way of finessing the view that will resolve the inconsistency, right? We can understand this view, which is put forward by Martin Cush, for example, this kind of response. Cush's view can be more plausibly understood as the view that Wittgensteinian relativism, the theory, is itself only true relative to the theoretician's frame of reference, while the claims that he might like to make about climate change are only true relative to the actor's frame of reference. There can't be any conflicts across these frame of reference because each is, in a sense, its own language game. So it's kind of a category mistake to see those two as in conflict. The idea is that playing both language games is a bit like playing football in the morning and chess in the afternoon. There's nothing wrong with doing both of those things. But even if the two language games are, strictly speaking, consistent with one another, I think there's still a tension between the theoretician's beliefs and the actor's beliefs. The reason is that, unlike chess and football, when we compare them, the theoretician's beliefs are rather obviously about the actor's beliefs and assertions. So as a theoretician, the Wittgensteinian relativist holds that consensus whether P is a necessary condition for the legitimacy of the claim that P is true. And then as an actor, she knows that there's no full consensus around climate change, yet still she holds that the belief in anthropogenic climate change is true. And she might even defend the legitimacy of that claim. on the basis of evidence. Right? There seems to be some undermining going on here, even if it's not strict incompatibility. So I think that there is a kind of incoherence here, and the incoherence can be brought out by considering another example of a statement that is consistent yet incoherent, would be incoherent to believe. This is an example that's due to the Cambridge philosopher G.E. Moore. They're called Moore paradoxical statements, and the statement that he considers is, it's raining and I don't believe that it's raining. Okay, so this statement is perfectly consistent. Indeed, it may well be true. So if I was in a room with no windows and I didn't know it was raining, it could be true that it's raining and I don't believe that it's raining. There's nothing wrong with that statement, but it would be completely incoherent for me to believe it. Right? Just as it would be completely incoherent for me to assert it. There are various different explanations for why this is the case, but what interests me here is just that this is a kind of incoherence that doesn't boil down to inconsistency. And my suggestion is that believing something like that, like a more paradoxical claim, is incoherent insofar as it's just irrational to hold both it's raining, to believe both it's raining and I don't believe it's raining simultaneously. So that is an irrational state of mind. It's an incoherent state of mind, even though there's no inconsistency. And I think that the relativist who opts for the different frames of reference strategy seems to be guilty of a similar sort of incoherence. It just doesn't seem to be rational to accept, while you're in the seminar room, that consensus is a necessary condition for the legitimacy of truth claims, and then 2 minutes later, step out of the seminar room and start making truth claims about some matter when you know that there's no consensus on it, right? This seems to be prima facie inconsistent, even if it can be treated as, strictly speaking, compatible, right? For the relativist to protest that she sees no tension between the two seems to be a protest that's being made in bad faith. Okay, so to conclude, I think the Quietism challenge ultimately sticks. There's an incoherence between some of the Wittgensteinian relativists' meta-theoretic claims and some of her object language commitments. In the face of this incoherence, the relativist faces a choice either to reject relativism or to give up on her environmentalism, or more generally, to give up on many object language debates, to give up on moral and political engagement. Though the Quietism challenge doesn't show that relativism is false, or even that it's internally inconsistent, the challenge is, I think, a powerful one nonetheless. It's a moral and political challenge, which seems to be particularly acute in the present post-truth age. So a relativist who responds to the Quietism challenge by choosing to fastidiously avoid engagement in object language debates about such issues as climate change only serves the interests of the rich and the powerful, the fossil fuel companies and political lobbyists who seek to deny the truth and the evidence. The relativists claim that it is either indeterminate or uncertain whether climate change is anthropogenic is far from neutral. It's not a neutral statement at all. It plays straight into the hands of the climate change deniers, who also claim that current scientific evidence leaves it uncertain whether there is anthropogenic climate change. I think there was recently a book put out by the Heritage Foundation that was sent to schools, which is titled something like, the ongoing debate about climate change. They want to make sure that people think there's no consensus forming on this issue and thereby be uncertain about the results of science. But the problem is that the choice to just wait till the dust settles and see whether consensus is formed around one view or another, is itself a choice that has moral consequences, and it seems to be morally objectionable since we need to act now or we run the risk of leaving it too late. Thank you.